3 horrifying reports about caves. Based on real stories. Not all terror comes from fiction. Story 1. Have you ever sensed that some places in this world were never meant to be discovered? That there exist locations where reality feels thinner, more fragile? I was once a man of science. I believed only in what I could measure, catalog, and comprehend. Now I record this testimony from a hospital bed. During those fleeting moments of lucidity they still permit between medications. You need to know the truth about what truly dwells within the Cave of Bones. My name is Adrian Novak. I was a respected speleologist with 12 years of experience exploring Europe's most challenging formations. My specialty? Documenting unexplored caverns in the Carpathian Mountains. My colleagues considered me methodical, cautious, perhaps excessively prudent. I never took unnecessary risks. I first heard about Păștera cu Oase in Romania during a conference in Bucharest. A Romanian colleague mentioned it almost confidentially. There's a cave in the Western Carpathians that locals avoid. They call it the gateway to hell. He smiled, as if sharing a harmless superstition. Initially, I was drawn by the scientific aspect. The Cave of Bones houses some of the oldest human remains in Europe, fossils dating back over 40,000 years. A veritable archaeological time capsule. But the more I researched, the more I noticed a disturbing pattern. Many scientific expeditions began with enthusiasm, but ended abruptly, without clear explanations. When I arrived in the small village of Anina near the cave, I realized something was different. The locals, typically hospitable to tourists, became reserved when I mentioned my interest in the site. Don't go alone, some warned. Others simply made the sign of the cross and walked away. At the village's only restaurant, an elderly man finally told me what everyone avoided saying. At night, we hear voices coming from that place. Lights that shouldn't exist pulse in the depths. Bones move by themselves, and the mist that speaks. I stayed at a small inn run by an elderly woman named Elena. On my first night, as I organized my equipment, she silently entered my room and placed something on the nightstand. For protection, she murmured in broken English. It was a small, Orthodox cross carved from dark wood. I thanked her politely, though I wasn't religious. When she left, I noticed the wood bore strange markings, ancient symbols seemingly burned into the surface. The next morning, while having coffee, I met a local shepherd named Mircea. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by time, but his eyes remained alive and alert. He sat at my table without asking permission. "I saw you preparing caving equipment," he said in Romanian, which I understood reasonably well. "Going to Păștera cu Oase," I confirmed, and he fell silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "2 weeks ago, I took my sheep. Near that area, it was almost dusk." He hesitated, rotating his coffee cup. "I saw lights inside the cave, blue like cold flames. No one was in there, I'm certain." "Lights can have natural explanations," I replied, trying to sound rational. "Phosphorescent minerals, natural gases." "And the whispers," he interrupted, "do they also have a scientific explanation?" "Whispers." When I approached, I felt something, a pressure in my ears like before a storm, and voices, many. Them speaking a language I've never heard. Ancient. Older than our people. I tried to maintain a neutral expression, but something in Mircea's conviction deeply unsettled me. "My grandfather said there exists the Porta de Piatra, At the cave's depths, he continued, a rock formation resembling a doorway. They say it's a portal to another place, a place where the dead wait. That afternoon, I met a middle-aged woman in a supply store. When I mentioned my expedition, she looked around to ensure we were alone. My brother worked on an archaeological excavation there 5 years ago, she said, her voice low. The team separated some bones for analysis. They left everything organized in a specific pattern. The next morning, she stopped, as if afraid to continue. What happened? I pressed. The bones. They were in a perfect circle, as if someone or something had rearranged them overnight. The entire team departed that same day. My brother never spoke about it again, even to family. The following morning, I began my preparation methodically. High-precision GPS, 3 different flashlights with extra batteries, emergency rations sufficient for 3 days, though I planned to spend only a few hours. Advanced medical kit, climbing rope, everything checked twice. Elena watched me from the doorway, her face a mask of concern. You will not return to sleep here tonight, she said. It wasn't a question. Of course I will, I replied, forcing a smile. It's just a preliminary exploration. She slowly shook her head. Do you have family? The question caught me off guard. Yes, parents in Austria, a sister in Germany. Call them before you go. That chilled me more than any ghost story. The path to the cave was surprisingly beautiful. The Carpathians in autumn are a spectacle of colors. Golds, reds, and ambers against the dark green of conifers. The sky was crystalline blue, cloudless. A perfect day for exploration. The cave entrance wasn't particularly impressive. A dark opening in the rocky hillside, partially covered by vegetation. Unaware travelers might pass by without noticing. I stopped a few meters from the entrance, feeling that familiar mixture of excitement and caution that precedes every exploration. I performed my final equipment check and turned on the digital recorder I always use to document my observations. Peshtera ku Oase, initial exploration, October 9th, 10:17 a.m., I dictated. Into the recorder, ideal weather conditions, external temperature 15 degrees Celsius. The first 30 meters were what I expected from any karst cave. A gradual slope, ceiling occasionally lowering, requiring me to bend. Typical limestone formations, some young stalactites. Nothing exceptional. Approximately 50 meters in, the tunnel opened into a first chamber. It was a spacious area, with a ceiling high enough for me to stand comfortably. I took some photographs, noting the beauty of the formations. First, chamber shows signs of ancient human occupation. I continued into the recorder. Soot marks on the ceiling indicate fire usage possibly thousands of years ago. Upon entering the second chamber, about 100 meters from the entrance, I noticed the first anomaly. My compass began behaving erratically, the needle spinning, without a defined direction. Notable magnetic interference, I recorded. Possibly ferrous mineral deposits in the walls. I advanced with more caution. The silence was different. Any speleologist knows cave silence. It's profound but not absolute. There's always some sound, water droplets, the occasional shifting of small stones, even the distant movement of animals like bats. But here, it was as if sound itself was absorbed. My own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air were denser. Upon entering the third chamber, approximately 300 meters from the entrance, I had the first indication that something was fundamentally wrong. The GPS, which had worked perfectly until then, began showing impossible coordinates. The temperature, which should have remained relatively constant, started dropping dramatically. Temperature dropping from 12 degrees Celsius to 7 degrees Celsius in a matter of minutes. I whispered into the recorder, watching my breath beginning to condense in the air. No apparent explanation for such a thermal shift. That's when I saw the mist. At the chamber's back, a pale mist began forming. At first, I thought it was merely natural condensation due to the temperature drop, but there was something wrong about how it moved. I remained motionless, observing. The mist didn't spread uniformly as expected. It moved with purpose against the natural airflow, as if it were conscious. Unusual atmospheric phenomenon recorded. I spoke into the recorder, my voice trembling slightly. Mist formation with non-natural movement pattern. I decided to approach for a better investigation. Each step was more difficult than the previous one. Not physically, but psychologically. As if some primitive part of my brain was screaming for me to retreat. The temperature continued dropping. 5 degrees C, 3 degrees C, 0 degrees C. My fingers were beginning to go numb inside my gloves. 10 meters from the mist, I heard the first whisper. It was so subtle that initially I thought it was just wind in some distant tunnel. But there was no wind there. I concentrated, trying to discern the sound. They were voices. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, speaking simultaneously in low, almost inaudible tones. Some seemed to speak modern languages I vaguely recognized. Fragments. Romanian, Hungarian, German. Others sounded more ancient with phonetic patterns reminiscent of Latin or archaic Greek. And then, clearly, I distinguished a voice in English. Adrian. I froze. No one knew my first name in the village. I had introduced myself as Dr. Novak. Adrian, come see. The voice was feminine, soft, familiar, horribly familiar. Mother? I whispered incredulously. My mother had passed away 3 years earlier, after a long battle with cancer. The last time I heard her voice was on a phone call when she could barely speak due to morphine. Adrian, darling, I'm waiting for you. The mist began moving toward me, not like vapor, but like water. Fluid, intentional. I instinctively backed away, but it seemed denser now, filling the chamber. Inexplicable phenomenon, I murmured into the recorder. The mist appears to respond to my presence. Temperature now below freezing. Auditory hallucinations possible due to hypothermia. I knew rationally that it must be hypothermia, or perhaps some natural gas causing hallucinations. There were scientific explanations for this, except the voice was exactly hers. Not as I remembered her in her final days, debilitated by disease, but as she was before, warm, nurturing. Adrian, there's so much to show you. The mist enveloped me. Suddenly, I could no longer see my flashlight or even my own hands. It was like being suspended in absolute void, except for the intense cold penetrating to my bones. The voices multiplied. Some pleaded, others warned. Many just murmured incessantly. And among them, my mother's voice continued, clearer than the others. Adrian, I'm trapped here. Please help me escape. Something deep within me knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. Whatever was speaking with her voice was something other. "This isn't real," I said aloud, trying to anchor myself to reality. "You are not my mother." The mist seemed to pulse as if breathing. The whispers silenced for a moment, and then I saw the eye. Amidst the whiteness of the mist, a dark form began materializing, circular at first, then elongating vertically. An immense eye, larger than my head. The iris was vertical, like that of a reptile or feline, but electric blue that seemed to emit its own light. The pupil was an abyss of absolute darkness, and it observed me, not merely looking in my direction, observing me with a conscious analytical intelligence. I felt dissected by that gaze, as if every thought, memory, and emotion was being extracted and examined. No animal, no being known to science possessed an eye like that. The terror was total, primordial. My recorder fell from my trembling hands. I turned and ran. I ran like I never had before, guided only by instinct. I no longer cared about directions, about abandoned equipment, about scientific rigor. I just ran, desperate for distance, for light, for reality. I felt something following me in the darkness. I couldn't hear footsteps, but I knew that eye was still watching me, even when I could no longer see it. I don't know how long I ran, minutes or hours. When I finally glimpsed the entrance light, my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. I stumbled out of the cave into the setting sun's light. I fell to my knees, breathless, feeling the sun's warmth on my face like a blessing. But something was wrong. The sun was setting. I had entered the cave shortly after 10 a.m. Only a few hours should have passed. My watch read 7:42 p.m. Almost 10 hours had elapsed. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. As I turned toward the cave entrance, I saw the mist. No longer confined to the interior, it leaked outward like smoke, appearing denser against the evening light. And within it, vaguely visible, an outline. Tall, thin, with almost human proportions, but wrong. Limbs too long, a head that moved in impossible ways. Then I saw the eye again, floating 6 feet above the ground, glowing with that unnatural blue light. Something in my mind simply broke. I remember screaming until my throat burned. I remember running through the forest, stumbling, falling, getting up only to run more. The rest comes in fragments, flashlight beams, concerned voices, Elena's face saying, "I warned you." An ambulance siren. The ceiling of a rural hospital. The doctors diagnosed severe hypothermia, dehydration, and what they politely called a temporary stress-induced psychotic episode. They talked about natural gases in caves that can cause hallucinations, about sensory deprivation, about the brain-filling voids with deeply ingrained fears. Rational, scientific explanations. Exactly the kind I would have offered before. That was 8 months ago. I spent the first 3 in a psychiatric institution, unable to form coherent sentences. Then they transferred me to this hospital in Vienna, closer to my family. I'm better now. The medications help. The therapists say I'm making exceptional progress. Perhaps in a few months I can resume a normal life. Except sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still see that eye watching me. And the mist, I'm certain I brought some of it back with me. Last week during the night, the nurse entered to check my vital signs. She stopped at the door, her face turning pale. "What is that mist in the corner of the room?" she asked. When I looked, there was nothing there, but I knew in that moment that I had never truly escaped. The doctors increased my medication after that. The nurse was transferred to another floor. No one else mentioned mist. But last night, I heard my mother's voice again whispering from the dark corner of the room, "Adrian, I'm still waiting for you." And behind her words, almost imperceptible, other voices. Dozens of them, hundreds, all calling for their loved ones. If you ever hear about Peștera cu Oase, the Cave of Bones in Romania, please believe the local residents. Some doors should not be opened. Some places should remain forgotten. And if someday you hear someone you love calling from a dark place, from a place that should contain no voice at all, don't answer, no matter how real it seems, because it isn't who you think it is. This story was based on actual accounts from the famous Cave of Bones in Romania. If you've had experiences in places that seem to exist at the boundary between worlds, share in the comments. And subscribe for more accounts from people who faced the inexplicable and lived to tell the tale. Which part of this experience did you find most disturbing? Leave your opinion below. Story 2. Some stories indigenous civilizations tell aren't meant as mere folklore. They're preserved as warnings across generations. The gravest error of my academic career was mistaking a warning for a simple anthropological curiosity. My name is Michael Reeves. I'm an archaeologist specializing in pre-Columbian cultures of the Great Basin Desert. What I'm about to reveal has never been documented in any academic journal or official report, because some truths are too dangerous to exist in public records. This is the account of the night I spent in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, and of the Iztapalapa. It began as routine research in the university library. I was preparing a paper on mythological narratives among Western American tribes when I discovered an obscure reference to the red-haired giants in Paiute tribal records. The Paiute narrative described the Iztapalapa as a race of hostile humanoids, extraordinarily tall, with reddish hair, who had inhabited the region long before the Paiutes arrived. According to legend, these beings were merciless aggressors who posed a constant threat to the tribe. The most unsettling part of the legend was its conclusion. After years of conflict, the Paiutes had managed to corner the last Iztapalapa in a cave, where they set fire to the entrance, eliminating them once and for all. A fascinating story, I thought. Tribal metaphor for territorial conflicts with another human group, probably, until I discovered the records from 1911. In 1911, workers extracting guano for fertilizer from Lovelock Cave made a disturbing discovery. Multiple human remains, including, according to contemporaneous accounts, skeletons with unusual characteristics. Some testimonies mentioned specimens over 8 feet tall, with vestiges of reddish hair preserved. Officially, most of these findings were catalogued as common human remains, or simply disappeared into the basements of museums and institutions. The standard explanation was that the workers, lacking archaeological training, had exaggerated their discoveries. But something troubled me. Too many coincidences between the Paiute legend and the physical findings. Science doesn't progress by ignoring anomalies. It progresses by investigating them. My obsession with Lovelock Cave truly began when I discovered the unpublished diary of Thomas Jenkins, one of the workers from that 1911 excavation. I acquired it at an estate auction, mixed among other seemingly valueless papers. Jenkins' notes were meticulous and disturbing. He wasn't uneducated as many academics presumed. He was self-taught with precise vocabulary and detailed observations. April 16, 1911, he wrote, Today we found the 17th skeleton, different from the others. The bone structure suggests an approximate height of 8 feet. Most disturbing, vestiges of organic tissue still adhered to the skull. Hair, red. The foreman insists it will be sent to Berkeley along with the others. Jenkins also described an unnatural silence within the cave, and dark red stains on the walls that, even when cleaned, reappear the following day. He mentioned that other workers felt a constant presence, as if something watched them from the deepest shadows. What truly chilled me was a casual insertion, almost like a footnote. Jenkins wrote, "Robbins, Ellis, and Parker decided not to return tomorrow. They say they heard voices coming from the unexplored areas during the night. Voices in a language none of them recognized." More disturbing still, researching these workers' names, I discovered all 3 died in strange circumstances in the following years. Robbins vanished in the desert without a trace. Ellis suffered a mental collapse, spending his final days in a sanitarium, obsessively drawing tall, slender figures with red hair on the walls. Parker, the youngest of the 3, apparently committed suicide in 1914. The note he left contained just one sentence: "They found a way out." I decided I needed to see the cave personally. I secured special permission from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, claiming research on geological formations and possible patterns of ancient human occupation. I didn't mention the CTK, didn't mention the unexplained deaths. Some doors open only with half-truths. In my rational mind, I was preparing the groundwork for a scientific paper that would demystify the legend, explaining it through historical and geological facts. But another part of me, an older and more intuitive part, was nervous. That part of us humans that still knows when something is fundamentally wrong. I arrived in Lovelock, Nevada, on an October afternoon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, with the sun descending behind the arid mountains. The small town seemed frozen in time, its main street nearly deserted except for a few local establishments still open. I checked into the only available motel and, after organizing my equipment, decided to visit the small local museum. The attendant, a middle-aged woman named Martha, brightened when I mentioned my interest in the cave. "Not many people ask about that nowadays," she commented. "There was a time when archaeologists came regularly, but that was decades ago." When I asked about the skeletons found in 1911, her enthusiasm visibly diminished. "Most were sent to universities or the Smithsonian," she said, avoiding my gaze. "They say they were lost during transport or cataloging." "All of them?" I insisted. She hesitated. "Well, there were rumors. My grandfather worked as an assistant in those excavations. He said that some findings were never officially recorded, that some of the men took things away before the academics arrived." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly man, Native American, with white hair tied in a ponytail and intensely dark eyes. Martha introduced him as Joseph, a respected member of the local Paiute tribe. When he learned of my interest in Lovelock Cave, Joseph observed me with a penetrating gaze. "You're camping there?" he asked directly. I confirmed that I intended to set up camp near the cave entrance. "Wouldn't it be more comfortable to stay at the motel and drive there in the morning?" I explained that I wanted to observe the location at dawn, to study how light interacted with the geography. Joseph nodded slowly. "Take this," he said, removing something from his neck. It was a small traditional medicine bag made of leather with colorful beads. Just a tradition. His casual tone contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. As I left the museum, I heard him say something quietly. "Don't answer if you hear your name." Lovelock Cave is located approximately 20 miles from town, in an arid area with spectacular rock formations. I parked my rental car at the end of a dirt road and continued on foot for about half a mile, carrying my camping and research equipment. The cave entrance was less impressive than I'd imagined. A dark opening in a rocky hillside, partially hidden by scrub vegetation. Archaeologically, this made sense. Places offering shelter in inhospitable regions rarely needed to be grandiose. I set up my tent approximately 150 feet from the entrance, where the terrain was flatter. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The temperature, which had been pleasant during the day, was starting to drop rapidly. As I prepared a small campfire, I noticed something strange. The silence. Deserts aren't really silent. There's constant wind, insects, small animals. But there, in the cave's perimeter, there was a disturbing absence of ambient sounds, as if something repelled all natural life. As the sky darkened and stars emerged with impressive clarity, I began my preliminary investigation. Equipped with a high-powered flashlight, I entered the first few meters of the cave. The interior was more spacious than the entrance suggested. Natural tunnels branched from the main hall in various directions. The floor showed clear signs of previous excavations, irregular depressions where guano had been removed, tool markings on the walls. That's when I noticed the first stains. Initially, they looked like simple mineral discolorations in the limestone, reddish with irregular shapes. I approached to examine a particularly large one. The stain was approximately the size of a human hand, but larger, the fingers disproportionately long. I touched it lightly and immediately felt a wave of nausea so intense I needed to lean against the wall to avoid falling. My head throbbed with sudden acute pain. And then, for a fleeting instant, so brief that I would later wonder if it wasn't just a trick of the light, I saw a face in the rocky surface. Distorted, with elongated features, mouth open in a silent scream. Then it vanished. I instinctively backed away, dropping some of my equipment. The metallic echo reverberated through the cave, seeming to amplify rather than diminish, as if the sound itself multiplied in the enclosed space. When the noise finally ceased, I realized something. I was no longer alone in the cave. No sound, no movement. Just the absolute, primordial certainty of a presence. Like a predator sensing when it's being watched by a stronger predator. I gathered my equipment with trembling hands and retreated to the entrance. "I'll return tomorrow in natural light," I said aloud, as if explaining my withdrawal to someone. No one answered. But something was listening. I returned to my camp and fed the fire, seeking both warmth and light. The medicine bag Joseph had given me felt heavy in my pocket. I'm not superstitious, but I placed it near the tent entrance anyway. Small psychological comforts have their value when you're alone in the desert. I checked my watch. 8:37 p.m. It was still early, but the travel fatigue and the adrenaline from the preliminary exploration had exhausted me. I prepared a simple dinner of trail rations and noted my initial observations in my field journal. Evidence of ancient human occupation is visible even in superficial examination, I wrote. Tool marks on the walls suggest systematic material extraction. Red stains on the rock could be mineral residues or possibly pigments used by ancient occupants for ritual markings. I didn't mention the sudden nausea, nor the face in the stone. There are things that don't belong in academic records, not until they're properly understood. I must have fallen asleep at some point sitting by the dying fire. The desert has that quality. The silence and vastness induce an almost meditative state. I don't know what time it was when I awoke. The fire had reduced to embers. The sky was clear, the nearly full moon illuminating the landscape with a silver light that transformed the desert into an alien panorama. Something had awakened me. A sound. Michael. It was my mother's voice. Impossible, of course. My mother had passed away 8 months earlier, after a long battle with aggressive cancer. Her final days were spent in a Boston hospital, thousands of miles away. Michael, I'm here. I need you. The voice came from the direction of the cave. Years of scientific training told me it was just the wind through rock formations, creating sound patterns that my semi-conscious mind interpreted as familiar, or perhaps a coyote or other desert animal, its sound being distorted by the local acoustics. Michael, please. I'm lost. I rose in a trance, automatically grabbing my flashlight. The voice was so real, so authentic, exactly as I remembered her before the illness. The small rational part of my brain still functioning made me also take the survival knife I always carried. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, though I knew no animal could mimic a human voice with such precision. I began walking toward the cave, the flashlight projecting a trembling beam across the uneven terrain. The voice continued, now lower, almost a whisper. Michael, I have so much to show you. I was approximately 60 feet from the entrance when I saw the eyes. 2 glowing points in the darkness near the cave entrance, orange-reddish like embers but cold. Much too high off the ground to belong to any native regional animal. I froze. The voice stopped. For a moment that seemed to extend indefinitely. We just stood there, me and whatever was watching me from the shadows. Then the eyes began to move toward me, and the voice returned. It still sounded like my mother, but there was something wrong now, an underlying quality like static on a radio, or as if another voice was speaking simultaneously, deeper, rougher. Michael. Come to me, Michael. The creature, I can't think of another word to describe it, advanced to the edge of the moonlight. It was my first clear glimpse, though still partially obscured by shadows. It was tall. Incredibly tall. Well over 7 feet, perhaps reaching 9. It had disproportionately long, thin limbs that moved in a slightly disjointed manner, as if its joints functioned differently from ours. What struck me most, however, was the hair, thick, abundant, falling from the shoulders to mid-back. Even in the silvery moonlight, its reddish coloration was unmistakable. For a brief moment, when the creature slightly turned its head, I could see its face, pale, almost white, with features that were almost human but distorted. The eyes too large, deeply sunken. The mouth, a thin line extending further laterally than should be possible. And the expression, hunger. Not merely physical, but something more fundamental. A hunger for something I couldn't comprehend. My entire body shook with primordial terror. It wasn't rational fear, it was something deeper, instinctive, as Our ancestors must have felt hearing predators' footsteps in the darkness beyond the fire. I dropped the flashlight and ran. Ran like I'd never run before, stumbling on stones, scratching myself on thorny bushes, propelled by pure terror. I heard heavy footsteps following me, steps that made the very ground tremble, and a sound, like bones being crushed, mixed with something that could be either laughter or a lament. I reached my car in record time, keys already in my trembling hand. When I turned the ignition, I looked in the rearview mirror. The creature was at the edge of the dirt road, partially illuminated by the car's headlights. Our gazes met through the mirror. It smiled. There are no words to adequately describe that smile. It wasn't exactly malevolence. It was more like a scientist's smile observing a bacterial culture. Interest, curiosity, patience. I floored the accelerator and didn't stop until I reached the lights of Lovelock. I spent the rest of the night locked in my motel room, curtains closed, all lights on. I told myself it had been a hallucination. Stress, fatigue, perhaps even some natural gas emanating from the cave. Rational, scientific explanations. But I knew at a visceral level that transcended rationality, that what I had seen was real. By dawn, I realized I'd abandoned all my equipment at the campsite. Tent, sleeping bags, most of my research tools, and my field journal with all my notes. As much as I wanted to simply get in the car and drive far away, I couldn't leave that evidence behind. I needed to recover it, not just for material value, but because it told a story that perhaps needed to be preserved. But I wouldn't go alone, not this time. I found Joseph at the small-town cafe as if he'd been waiting for me. Perhaps he had. I sat at his table uninvited and, without preamble, told him what I'd seen. He listened in silence, without surprise, without disbelief. When I finished, he simply nodded. "Siteka," he finally said. The ancient Paiute people tried to warn the white men. Some listened, most didn't. "You knew," I accused. "You knew what I would find there." "Suspected," he corrected. "The stories of my people say not all were destroyed in that ancient fire. Some found deeper paths, tunnels leading to places we don't understand. They wait. They watch. Sometimes they hunt." "Hunt what?" Joseph stared at me with those dark, intense eyes. "You know what they hunt." Joseph agreed to accompany me to the campsite to recover my equipment. On the way, he told me more about the Siteka, not as legends or folklore, but as historical facts passed down through generations. "They weren't like us," he explained. "Taller, stronger. They thought differently, saw the world differently. To them, we were food, not just for the body, but for something else." Something else? They fed on fear, on despair, on crushed hope. It was part of the ritual. When we arrived at my campsite, we found everything intact. My tent was still pitched, my sleeping bag laid out, the circle of stones for the fire, exactly as I had left it. Except for one thing. My research journal was open, carefully placed in the center of the camp, open to a page where I had drawn a rudimentary map of the cave. And on that page was a handprint, made with some dark red substance that was still wet to the touch. A hand with abnormally long fingers and strange joints, far too large to be human. Joseph stood motionless beside me. "It was here," he murmured. "Recently." As we hastily gathered my equipment, I noticed something I had ignored the night before. Marks on the ground around the camp. Not exactly footprints, but elongated depressions. as if something very heavy had walked in circles around my tent while I slept. "Why didn't it attack while I was sleeping?" I asked as we threw the last items into the car trunk. Joseph shrugged. "They have their own rituals, own rules. Maybe the medicine bag helped, maybe it was just playing with you, like cats sometimes play with prey." As we drove away, I looked one last time at the cave entrance in the distance. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a tall, slender figure standing there, watching our departure. But when I blinked, there was nothing. I never returned to Nevada after that day. I abandoned my research on the Iztapalapa, at least officially. I changed my specialization to Pueblo ceramics, something safe, well documented, without disturbing mysteries. Joseph sent me some materials. In the following months, traditional Paiute tales, records of unexplained disappearances in the region over the centuries. He passed away last year. The obituary mentioned guardian of tribal traditions. Science gives us a language to understand the world, a framework to classify and catalog. But there are things that exist at the borders of this framework, at the margins of our understanding, things that observe our civilizations rise and fall, patient as mountains. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I still dream of orange eyes watching me from the shadows. I wake up hearing my mother's voice calling my name from empty hallways, increasingly distorted with each repetition. The Paiute tribe never just told legends. They tried to warn us. The Iztapalapa weren't completely destroyed in that fire thousands of years ago. Some survived in the depths of the earth, in caves and tunnels that perhaps connect the entire continent. Waiting, watching. And even today, when I read about solitary hikers who disappear without explanation in the Western American wilderness, I can't help but wonder, did they also hear voices calling from the shadows? Did they see orange eyes watching them from the darkness? Some secrets perhaps should remain buried, some caves sealed forever. But I know somehow that they're still there, waiting, and that somehow they know my name. This story was based on real discoveries made in Lovelock Cave and the legends of the Paiute tribe. The giant skeletons were really found in the early 20th century, though their current whereabouts remain a mystery. If you visited places with unsettling indigenous histories, share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more accounts from places where the ancient past meets our present, and sometimes watches us from the shadows. Story 3. Before I begin, I implore you not to repeat this place's name aloud. This isn't superstition or dramatization. It's a warning born from experience. Some names, when spoken, open doorways that should remain forever sealed. My name is Carlos Vega. What I'm about to share happened 15 years ago when I was only 16. Until today, I've never told this story publicly. I believe the time has come for the truth about that cave in Iztapalapa to finally emerge from the shadows. Some places in this world aren't merely physical locations. They're wounds in reality itself. And the cave I visited that October night continues to bleed even now. I grew up in Iztapalapa, one of Mexico City's most populous and ancient districts. To tourists, Iztapalapa rarely appears on itineraries. It's considered a troubled area with social challenges. But for those born there, it's a place of profound cultural richness and history. Iztapalapa's skyline is dominated by Cerro de la Estrella, a hill that stands sentinel over the neighborhood. To modern eyes, it's just a geological formation. But to the ancient Mexica people, it was sacred ground where, every 52 years, They performed the Fuego Nuevo ritual, kindling a new flame to ensure the sun would continue to rise. Today, the tradition continues symbolically. During Holy Week, thousands climb Cerro de la Estrella for the famous Passion of Christ reenactment, life and death intertwined in ritual, as they always have been in that place. What few tourists know is that the Cerro is punctured by numerous caves. Some are small, mere shelters in the rock. Others burrow into the earth like dark veins. One of them, located on the northern face, is known to locals as, well, let's call it Cueva del D, a name that carries both respect and fear. Near the cave stands the Church of La Cuevita, a small sanctuary built centuries ago. According to local tradition, a Christ image was found in the area, and when they attempted to move it to a larger church downtown, the statue mysteriously returned to its original place overnight. 3 times they tried, 3 times it returned. The elders say Christ chose to remain there to protect people from what dwells within the cave, as sentinel, as guardian. I grew up hearing stories about that place. My grandmother said the cave seduces with visions of gold and wealth, but that whoever enters never returns, at least not completely. She told of voices that call from the shadows, whispering the names of those who pass nearby. As a rebellious, skeptical teenager, I laughed at these stories. Superstitions of an older generation, I thought. Tales created to keep young people away from dangerous places where they might use substances or engage in illicit activities. I didn't know I was about to discover the truth behind those warnings. It all began on a Friday after school. My group of friends, Alejandro, his younger brother Emilio, and I, were planning how to spend the weekend. Alejandro, always the boldest, suggested exploring Cerro de la Estrella at night. We could bring some drinks, make a small bonfire. It would be amazing to see the city lights from up there, he argued. I agreed, though with some hesitation. The Cerro wasn't considered safe at night, not because of legends, but because of very mundane urban safety concerns. That's when Emilio, usually the quietest among us, mentioned almost casually, "We could visit the Cueva del D. They say if you enter at midnight, you can see the treasure hidden by the Aztecs." Alejandro laughed, but his eyes gleamed with genuine interest. "Do you really believe those old men's stories?" "My uncle Miguel says he saw something there," Emilio replied defensively. "He was herding goats near the Cerro and saw a beautiful woman standing at the cave entrance, beckoning to him." "And did he go to her?" I asked, suddenly interested. He started to, but when he got closer, her face changed. Her eyes turned completely black, her mouth opened wider than humanly possible. He ran and never returned to that part of the hill. We laughed at the story, but something about it stayed with me. I'd always been fascinated by the unexplainable, even while considering myself skeptical. "Probably just a local resident trying to scare strangers away," concluded Alejandro. "But now I'm curious. Shall we go there tomorrow night?" On my way home, I passed through the local market where my mother always bought vegetables. That's where I first saw Don Sebastian. He appeared to be an ordinary elderly man, white hair, face wrinkled by the sun, leaning on a simple cane. He wore traditional clothes that seemed to belong to another era. What caught my attention was how he observed me through the market, stalls with a fixed gaze that seemed to penetrate my skin. When our eyes met, he smiled and began walking toward me, with a difficulty that immediately awakened my compassion. "Young man," he called in old-style Spanish, the kind my grandparents spoke, Forgive an old man for troubling you, but I need help. My donkey escaped and I believe it went up the Cerro. My legs aren't what they used to be. Could you help me? Find it, I'll pay for your time." Something in his voice conveyed immediate trust, and the offer of payment was tempting. I grew up in a family where every extra peso made a difference. "I can go tomorrow, sir," I replied. I was just planning to climb the Cerro with friends. The old man's face lit up with a smile that, in hindsight, seemed almost predatory. "Perfect. The more hands to search, the better. I'll meet you at the foot of the Cerro when the sun begins to set." "How did you know I have friends?" I asked, realizing I hadn't mentioned this. He just smiled. "An old man knows things, young one. An old man always knows." That night, I dreamed of a woman standing at the entrance of a dark cave, her face continuously shifting between inhuman beauty and something my brain refused to fully process. She called my name with a voice that seemed composed of many voices layered together. I woke up in a cold sweat. Outside my window, an unusual mist hovered over Iztapalapa, something rare for that time of year. The following afternoon, we met Don Sebastian as arranged at the foot of Cerro de la Estrella. The sun was beginning its descent, painting Mexico City's sky in surreal shades of orange and purple, intensified by the permanent layer of pollution. Hiwai seemed different in the evening light, taller, less stooped. His eyes, which I remembered as brown, now appeared darker, almost black from certain angles. "I appreciate your punctuality, young men," he said, his voice deeper than I recalled. "My animal is stubborn, but knows the way home well. I suspect it's grazing somewhere high on the Cerro, or perhaps has found shelter in one of the caves." We began climbing a trail that diverged from the main path that tourists and pilgrims normally used. Don Sebastian moved with surprising agility for someone who appeared to be over 70 and who the previous day could barely walk. "Do you know the Cerro well?" asked Alejandro, as we advanced through increasingly dense vegetation. "I've known this place since before you were born, young man. Since before your grandparents were born, in fact." There was something strange in how he pronounced those words, as if they contained a hidden meaning. As we climbed, I noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. The sounds of the city below seemed to diminish more quickly than distance would justify. The air became denser, almost oppressive, though we were ascending to higher ground where it should normally be more rarefied. And there was the silence. Not absolute silence, but the gradual absence of natural sounds that should have been present. The birds had stopped singing. Even the insects seemed to have disappeared. Alejandro approached me while Don Sebastian advanced ahead with Emilio. "Are you noticing something strange about this old man?" he whispered. I nodded, relieved not to be the only one feeling it. "He seems different from yesterday. More stronger," Alejandro completed. "And his eyes, have you noticed?" Before we could continue our conversation, Don Sebastian stopped abruptly. We were in an area of the Cerro I had never visited before, despite having grown up nearby. A small clearing surrounded by irregular rock formations. "I believe my animal went through there." He pointed to an opening between the rocks, a cave entrance partially hidden by scrub vegetation. Something in my mind screamed in alert. The location perfectly matched the descriptions I'd heard about the cueva. Dildi. But we were far from the usual paths in an area I didn't even know was accessible. "You think your donkey went in there?" asked Emilio, clearly uncomfortable. "He likes darkness and coolness," replied Don Sebastian. "You are young and agile. Can you check quickly while I rest these old legs?" The sun had almost completely disappeared now, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. The cave entrance seemed to absorb what little light remained, like a vortex of darkness. "Perhaps we should return tomorrow, in daylight," I suggested, a feeling of dread growing in my chest. Don Sebastian turned to me and, for an instant, so brief that I later questioned whether it had really happened, his eyes reflected the twilight with an unnatural red glow, like an animal's, eyes captured in night photography. "Don't worry, young man," he said, his voice suddenly deeper, more resonant. "You won't be long, you'll find what you're looking for." Something in the way he said this made my hair stand on end. Alejandro, always the bravest, or most reckless, Fuss shrugged and headed toward the cave entrance. "Let's get this over with. Emilio, do you have the flashlight?" Don Sebastian suggested I stay with him while the brothers checked inside. "To keep me company," he explained. "This time of day always makes me nostalgic. For some reason I can't explain. I felt it would be safer to go with the others." "I prefer to help with the search, sir. 3 pairs of eyes see more than 2. A flash of irritation crossed the old man's face, quickly replaced by a forced smile. "As you prefer, young man." Equipped with 2 flashlights we'd brought for our planned night on the Cerro, we entered the dark opening. The air coming from it was surprisingly cold and carried a peculiar odor. Not the musty smell one would expect, but something older, like dust from bones and dry stone. The first few meters of the cave were what one might expect, an irregular tunnel that gradually descended, illuminated only by the trembling beams of our flashlights. The walls displayed marks that could be natural or perhaps very ancient carvings, worn away by time. "Have you heard the stories about this cave?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely muffled, as if the air itself consumed the sound. "My grandfather told me that the ancient Mexica used some caves in the Cerro for rituals," replied Emilio, his flashlight illuminating what appeared to be soot marks on the ceiling. Not just the Fuego Nuevo, but other types of ceremonies. Some involving... He stopped as if hesitating to continue. "Involving what?" Alejandro insisted. "Human offerings," Emilio completed, his voice almost a whisper. "Not just for the sun, but for other entities. Things that lived in darkness, beneath the earth." Alejandro forced a laugh that echoed strangely through the tunnel. "Stories to frighten children, or to keep the curious away from archaeological sites." We continued advancing, the tunnel occasionally opening into small chambers before narrowing again. We called for the lost animal a few times, but our voices simply disappeared into the darkness, with no echo returning. After approximately 10 minutes of constant descent, the tunnel opened into a significantly larger chamber. Our flashlights couldn't reach the ceiling or the distant walls, creating the impression we were suspended in an unlimited void. "This is much larger than I expected," murmured Alejandro, his previous confidence visibly shaken. The chamber floor was surprisingly regular, almost as if it had been intentionally leveled. In the center, we noticed what looked like a low stone altar, covered with engraved markings. "I don't think we'll find any donkey here," I said, a feeling of unease growing with each second. "We should go back." "Wait," Emilio pointed his flashlight at one of the walls. "Look at that." On the rocky surface, partially hidden by centuries of dust, were drawings or pictograms. We approached for a better look, The images showed human figures prostrate before something much larger, with a vaguely humanoid shape, but with wrong proportions. Limbs too long, a head that didn't appear human. Below these figures, smaller ones showed what seemed to be people entering a cave, and then distorted figures emerging, as if something had changed in their basic structure. "It's just cave art," stated Alejandro, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. "Ancient peoples representing their gods or something." That's when we realized we were no longer alone in the chamber. We didn't hear footsteps, didn't see movement. We simply felt a presence, that primordial sensation of being watched that was bequeathed to us by ancestors who needed to detect predators in the darkness. We turned simultaneously. Don Sebastian was standing silently at the chamber entrance observing us. We hadn't seen how or when he had followed us. "Found what you're looking for?" he asked, his voice different now, deeper, more resonant, with a quality that made the very bones vibrate. "Your animal isn't here, sir," replied Emilio, nervousness evident in his voice. "We should go back, it's getting late." Don Sebastian smiled. It was no longer the smile of a harmless old man. "But you've only just arrived, and there's so much to see." He took a step forward, and something in his movement was wrong, as if his limbs had more joints than they should. "Who are you?" asked Alejandro, instinctively backing away. Don Sebastian's smile widened impossibly. "I have many names. The ancients had a special name for me, but you can continue calling me Don Sebastian if you prefer." So now that's when I noticed something at his feet. What initially appeared to be just shadow began to move independently, spreading across the cave floor like ink spilled in water. It was an almost liquid darkness, denser than natural shadows, that seemed to completely absorb the light from our flashlights. "What's happening?" shouted Emilio, his face pale in the flashlight's reflection. Don Sebastian's form began to change subtly, stretching, becoming taller, more angular. His wrinkled skin now seemed like an ill-fitting mask over something that definitely wasn't human. "You came looking for treasure, didn't you?" The voice now came from all corners of the chamber simultaneously. They all do, for gold, for fame, for knowledge, but the real treasure is something else. The liquid darkness at his feet began, forming patterns, symbols that seemed to change and twist even as we watched them, symbols that somehow I seemed to almost recognize, like words in a language I never studied, but that resonated in some ancestral memory. "Run!" I shouted, primordial terror taking hold of me. Emilio was the first to move, running for the tunnel through which we had entered. Alejandro and I immediately followed him. I could hear Don Sebastian, or whatever he was, laughing behind us, a sound that seemed to consist of multiple overlapping voices. We ran through the tunnel in absolute panic, our flashlights creating dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The path seemed different now, longer with more turns than I remembered. The sensation was of running in a nightmare where corridors extend infinitely. "Is he coming after us?" Alejandro shouted as we ran. I didn't dare look back. Just keep running. That's when I realized I no longer heard Emilio's footsteps ahead of us. "Emilio," I called, slightly reducing my speed. "Emilio." There was no response. The tunnel ahead of us forked into two identical paths. "Which one?" asked Alejandro, panic evident in his voice. "Which way did we come?" Before I could answer, we heard Emilio's voice coming from the left tunnel. "Over here, quick, I found the exit." Something in the voice didn't sound right. It was Emilio, but at the same time, it wasn't. Like an almost perfect imitation, but with wrong nuances, intonations that didn't belong to him. "It's not him," I whispered to Alejandro, holding his arm when he began to move toward the voice. "It's not Emilio." "Carlos, Alejandro, please come quickly." Emilio's voice was now more desperate, more pleading. "He's coming, I need help." Alejandro's eyes filled with tears. It was his younger brother calling. His instinctive protection came into conflict with the growing terror. "We have to help him," he insisted. "It's not him," I repeated more firmly. "Remember Emilio's uncle's story, the woman in the cave? That's what's happening." From the right tunnel, we heard another familiar voice calling, my mother. "Carlos, dear, why are you taking so long? We're waiting for you." My blood froze. My mother was at home, miles away. It was impossible for her to be in the cave. "It's a trap," I whispered, pulling Alejandro back. "We have to find another way." The voices continued calling us from both tunnels, becoming increasingly desperate, more seductive. With each moment, they sounded more authentic, awakening an almost unbearable desire to respond, to follow. I noticed a smaller opening, almost imperceptible in the main tunnel wall. A narrow passage we hadn't seen on the way down. "That way," I indicated. "We need to try a different path." The opening was so narrow we had to squeeze through sideways. For some claustrophobic moments, I was trapped between the stone walls, unable to advance or retreat. Panic threatened to consume me, but then the rock yielded slightly and I could move again. The tunnel where we found ourselves now was older, less natural. The walls displayed deliberate carvings and symbols similar to those we had seen in the main chamber. "What is this place?" murmured Alejandro, his flashlight visibly trembling in his hand. I didn't answer. I was focused on finding a way up, out. The air in this tunnel seemed fresher, suggesting a connection to the exterior. We advanced cautiously, alert to any sound of pursuit. The voices that had been calling us had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. After what seemed an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward, and I felt a slight breeze touching my sweaty face. Hope was reborn in me. "I think we're near the surface," I whispered. That's when we heard, not with our ears but somehow directly in our minds, a sound like thousands of voices whispering simultaneously in unintelligible languages. And among them, clearly distinguishable, the voices of Emilio, my mother, and dozens of others that seemed extracted directly from our memories. The tunnel ahead began to darken, not from the absence of light, but as if darkness itself was a physical substance pouring in our direction. The same liquid darkness we had seen at Don Sebastian's feet. "He found us," murmured Alejandro, terror evident in his voice. In the growing darkness, forms began to materialize. Human silhouettes but distorted, elongated, with limbs that moved at impossible angles. They were like three-dimensional shadows, denser than the surrounding darkness. Among them, I recognized Don Sebastian's form, now completely transformed. Much taller, more angular, with disproportionately long limbs, and a head that tilted at an angle no human neck would allow. "You can't simply leave," said the creature with Don Sebastian's voice, though the sound seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. "Everyone who enters leaves something here, a part of themselves." The shadowy forms advanced slowly, toward us, as if savoring our growing terror. I realized with horror that some of them seemed vaguely familiar, like distorted versions of missing people whose photos I had seen on posts in local newspapers over the years. Cornered, we backed up to a recess in the tunnel wall. My mind raced frantically in search of an exit, a solution. That's when I remembered the medicine bag that Joseph had given me at the beginning of the story. Not the actual bag, of course, but something similar I carried in my pocket. A small crucifix my grandmother had insisted I take, blessed at the Church of La Cuevita. I removed the crucifix from my pocket. I didn't really expect it to work, but I was desperate. To my surprise, the shadows seemed to hesitate, backing slightly from the light reflected on the small silver object. "The church," I whispered to Alejandro. "The legend of the Christ image that protects against what lives in the cave. There must be something true in it." The shadows seemed agitated now, moving more quickly, but maintaining distance from the crucifix I held with a trembling hand. "What do we do?" asked Alejandro, his voice almost inaudible. I noticed that the breeze I had felt earlier came from a crack in the tunnel wall above our heads. Narrow opening, but possibly wide enough for us to pass through. "There," I pointed. "We need to climb." The wall was irregular enough to offer handholds and footholds. Alejandro, being taller, managed to reach the opening first. As he hoisted himself into it, I used the crucifix to keep the shadows at bay, moving it in wide arcs that seemed to create a temporary perimeter of safety. The form that had been Don Sebastian watched with what seemed to be scientific curiosity. "Clever," it said, the voice now completely inhuman. "But futile in the end. We already have one of you, and you'll return. They all return eventually, with fee." A final desperate effort. I grabbed Alejandro's extended hand and hoisted myself into the rock fissure. It was a claustrophobically narrow space, but I immediately felt fresh air coming from somewhere ahead. A promise of escape, of survival. We crawled through the vertical tunnel, scraping hands and knees on the rough surfaces, propelled by pure terror of what followed us. Below, I heard impossible sounds to describe, like fabric being torn but on a much larger scale, as if reality itself was being ripped apart. The darkness at our feet seemed to move with its own purpose, snaking up the narrow tunnel toward us. It wasn't simply the absence of light. It was something tangible, an ancient substance that devoured all luminosity. "Faster," gasped Alejandro ahead of me, his voice strangled by fear. The tunnel began to widen, and suddenly we emerged into a small natural cave illuminated by a crack in the ceiling, through which the starry night sky was visible. We were in a completely different part of Cerro de la Estrella, far from the entrance through which we had originally descended. When we finally crawled out of that opening, the fresh night air was like a rebirth. We fell onto the rocky ground, breathless, trembling uncontrollably. The stars above seemed impossibly bright and beautiful. I never appreciated the night sky as much as in that moment. The assurance that we were back in the natural world, away from that place where the laws of reality bent and broke. "Emilio," murmured Alejandro after a few moments, his voice broken by exhaustion and grief. "We have to go back for him." I struggled to a sitting position, every muscle in my body protesting. "Alejandro, I think Emilio is no longer there." "What do you mean?" "We need to call for help, police, rescue teams." I looked at my friend, unable to verbalize what we both already knew. Anyone who entered those caves looking for Emilio would find only what we found. That thing, Don Sebastian, said it already had one of us. I remembered. my voice almost a whisper. I think it was talking about Emilio. We remained hidden among the rocks until dawn, fearing the shadows might find us again. When the first rays of sun finally crossed the horizon, we descended Cerro de la Estrella in silence, our bodies exhausted, our minds still processing the horror of the previous night. Emilio's parents organized searches. The police scoured the Cerro for days. Volunteers explored every trail, every ravine. Alejandro and I accompanied them, pretending not to know what had happened, guiding them away from that specific cave whenever we could. "Why don't we tell the truth?" Alejandro asked me one afternoon when we were alone. Maybe someone would believe. "Who would believe?" I replied. "They would say we invented the story to cover up some accident, or that we went mad from trauma." And if someone did believe and went to investigate, I left the sentence unfinished. We both knew what would happen. A week after the disappearance, something was found at the base of the cerro. Emilio's disposable camera. He always carried one, passionate about photography even before having a digital camera. When the photos were developed, most were completely black or severely underexposed. Except one. The only distinguishable image showed the dark interior of the cave, captured in the flash. In the background, partially visible, was a figure, tall, incredibly tall, with impossible proportions. What appeared to be a head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The face was indistinct except for two bright points where the eyes should be. The police classified the image as indeterminate, probably an accidental double exposure or some other photographic artifact. For Alejandro and me, it was confirmation of the unimaginable. They never found Emilio. 15 years have passed since that night. Alejandro moved to another state, unable to continue living in the shadow of Cerro de la Estrella and the memories it holds. We rarely speak, and when we do, we never mention what happened. As for me, I've never managed to leave Iztapalapa. Something keeps me here, as if a part of me remained in that cave along with Emilio. Perhaps it did. Years later, when I was studying anthropology at university, I discovered accounts from speleologists who explored parts of the Cerro's caves. They described hearing unexplained laments and voices without visible source. An entire group abandoned an expedition when their electronic equipment simultaneously failed, and they felt what they described as a hostile presence watching. In ancient Mesoamerican traditions, caves were considered entrances to the underworld, Mictlan, realm of the dead. Places where the fabric of reality was thinner, where entities from other planes of existence could interact with our world. What disturbs me most is that stories almost identical to the Cueva to that cave, appear in different regions. Mexico. The details vary, but the central elements remain. An entity that disguises itself as human, often an elderly person asking for help, promises of gold or hidden treasures, and people who are never found again. Sometimes, when I pass by the Church of La Cuevita, I observe the ancient Christ image that, according to legend, refused to be moved from there. Now I understand why. It wasn't superstition, but ancestral knowledge, a guardian intentionally placed to protect against what dwells in the depths. And on the darkest nights when the wind blows from Cerro de la Estrella toward my window, I swear I hear voices calling. Sometimes it's Emilio, sometimes my parents or childhood friends. And on rare occasions when I'm almost falling asleep, I hear my own voice calling from somewhere deep and dark. I never answer, and I advise you to do the same. If someday a stranger approaches you near a cave, an abandoned mine, or any opening that leads to the depths of the earth, if they ask for your help to find something lost, if they promise rewards or play on your compassion, remember this story, because there are things much older than our civilization living in the shadows of the earth, waiting for unwary prey, and they know your name even before you introduce yourself. This story was based on the real legends of the cave in Iztapalapa and documented accounts about Cerro de la Estrella. Have you ever had that feeling of being watched in a supposedly empty place? Have you heard similar stories in your region? Share in the comments and subscribe for more accounts from people who face the impossible and live to tell the story. There are legends that are born of lies, but there are those that are born of truth. The difference is that when they are real, you never sleep easy again.